The yellow school bus pulled up to Westfield Middle School under a cloudy September sky. Among the students stepping off was Terrell Jackson, a quiet 12-year-old boy with warm brown eyes that took in everything around him. His wrinkled navy uniform still had the price tag residue on the sleeve. It was new, but bought in a rush the night before from a discount store. His mother had promised to iron it properly for tomorrow. Today was Terrell's first day at Westfield, a school in the wealthy part of town where most kids arrived in shiny SUVs, not public buses. 2 weeks ago, they'd moved from Pine Heights after his mother got a job at the local hospital. It paid better, which they desperately needed after his father left 3 years ago. Terrell clutched his worn backpack tighter as he walked through the large glass doors. Inside, the hallways gleamed with polished floors and trophy cases filled with awards. Kids chatted in groups, their voices echoing against the lockers. Nobody noticed him, which was exactly what he wanted. At his old school, keeping your head down meant staying out of trouble, following the schedule he'd received in the mail. Terrell found his first class, English with Ms. Powell. The teacher, a young woman with curly red hair, smiled as he handed her his transfer slip. "Welcome to Westfield, Terrell. You can take that empty seat by the window." The morning passed slowly. In each class, Terrell sat quietly, taking notes and speaking only when called on. During lunch, he found an empty corner table and ate the sandwich his mother had packed. He noticed the cafeteria had a salad bar and hot meals that cost more than what they budgeted for his entire week of lunches. Fifth period was music class. Terrell felt a small spark of excitement for the first time that day. Back home, his grandfather had taught him piano since he was 4 years old. Grandpa Joe had played in jazz clubs across the country when he was younger. "Music speaks when words can't," he always said, guiding Terrell's small hands over the keys of their old upright piano, a family treasure that had traveled with them to their new apartment. The music room was bigger than his entire apartment. Instruments lined the walls, violins, flutes, clarinets, and in the corner a gleaming black grand piano that made Terrell's heart skip. Posters of classical composers, all white men with serious expressions, hung on the walls. Mrs. Fletcher stood at the front of the room. She was tall with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. Her eyes scanned the room as students filed in, her mouth set in a thin line. "Take your assigned seats," she commanded, her voice sharp as a knife. Terrell approached her desk with his transfer slip. She looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as they landed on his face. "And you are?" "Terrell Jackson, ma'am. I'm new." She took the paper between 2 fingers as if it might be dirty. "I wasn't informed of any new students." She scanned the paper. "Jackson, from Pine Heights Community School?" The way she said it made Pine Heights sound like a disease. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Fletcher's mouth tightened further. "We do things differently here at Westfield. We have standards." Her eyes flicked over his uniform. "Your shirt needs ironing." Heat crept up Terrell's neck. "Yes, ma'am, sorry. Take that seat in the back. Try to catch up as best you can." The chair she pointed to was in the corner, partially blocked by a storage cabinet. Terrell made his way there, feeling eyes on him as he passed. Mrs. Fletcher began the class by discussing their upcoming winter concert. "This year's theme is classical excellence. We'll be focusing on the European masters, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, true musical geniuses." From his corner, Terrell could barely see the whiteboard where she wrote the names. His grandfather had taught him about those composers, but also about Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, and Thelonious Monk, names that didn't appear on Mrs. Fletcher's list. When she asked questions about music theory, Terrell raised his hand several times. Mrs. Fletcher's gaze swept past him as if he were invisible, calling on other students instead. "Now," she continued, "I'll need 2 students to demonstrate major and minor scales on the piano." Her eyes scanned the room. "Anthony and Lily, come up, please." A blonde boy and a girl with a long ponytail walked to the piano. Each played a scale, hitting wrong notes occasionally. Mrs. Fletcher nodded approvingly anyway. "Very good. Now who can tell me why minor scales often evoke sadness?" Terrell raised his hand again. This time Mrs. Fletcher seemed to have no choice. He was the only one with a hand up. "Yes." "Terrell, was it? Minor scales have a flattened 3rd, 6th, and sometimes 7th note, which creates tension that sounds melancholy to our ears," he said, repeating what his grandfather had taught him. "Jazz musicians often use minor scales too. We're discussing classical music, not jazz." Mrs. Fletcher cut him off. her voice cold. Please stick to the topic. A few students glanced back at him with curious expressions. A boy with glasses whispered something to his friend. When class ended, Terrell gathered his book slowly. As he reached the door, Mrs. Fletcher called out, "Mr. Jackson." He turned. "Yes, ma'am?" "Westfield has a certain reputation to maintain. Our music program has won regional championships 3 years running. I expect all students to meet our standards of excellence and behavior." The message was clear. She didn't believe he belonged. "I understand, ma'am." The rest of the day dragged on. By final bell, Terrell's shoulders ached from carrying the weight of feeling like an outsider. He was one of the few black students in a sea of white faces, and after music class he felt even more alone. The bus ride home was noisy, with kids shouting and laughing. Terrell pressed his forehead against the cool window glass, watching neighborhoods change from manicured lawns to apartment buildings with laundry hanging on balconies. When he got home, the apartment was empty. His mother wouldn't be back from her shift until 7. He made himself a snack and sat at the old piano in their living room, running his fingers over the familiar ivory keys, smooth from generations of use. Playing softly at first, then with growing confidence, he lost himself in a Chopin piece his grandfather had taught him last summer. The music filled the small apartment, transforming the space. In these notes, Terrell found his voice, the one Mrs. Fletcher had silenced in class. He was deep into the piece when he heard the key in the lock. His mother entered, still in her nurse's scrubs, looking tired but smiling when she heard the music. "That sounds beautiful, baby," she said, setting down her bag. "How was your first day?" Terrell's hand stilled on the keys. He thought about telling her everything, about Mrs. Fletcher's cold eyes, about being ignored when he raised his hand, about feeling like a stain on the school's perfect record. But he saw the dark circles under his mother's eyes, remembered how hard she'd worked to get this job, how she'd said this move was their chance for a better life. The last thing she needed was more worries. "It was fine," he said instead. "The school's nice, big." His mother sat beside him on the piano bench, her weight familiar and comforting. "I'm proud of you, Terrell. New schools aren't easy. It'll get better." She kissed his forehead and went to change out of her work clothes. Later that night, after dinner, Terrell called his grandfather. "Hey, Grandpa Joe. There's my piano man. How's that fancy new school treating you?" Terrell hesitated, then said, "The music teacher, she's different from my old one." "Different how?" His grandfather's voice grew serious. "She doesn't seem to like me much." Terrell traced patterns on his bedspread. "Today in class, she ignored me when I raised my hand. And when I did answer a question, she cut me off when I mentioned jazz." His grandfather was quiet for a moment. "Some people have narrow minds, Terrell. They only see what they expect to see. Oh, what should I do? Keep your head high. Know your worth. And remember what I always tell you about music. It doesn't care what color your skin is," Terrell finished. "That's right. The piano doesn't judge you by anything except how you play it." His grandfather's voice softened. "You've got music in your soul, boy. Don't let anyone dim that light." After hanging up, Terrell pulled out his music book and practiced until his mother told him it was bedtime. As he lay in bed, he thought about tomorrow. Mrs. Fletcher would still be there with her cold eyes and dismissive tone. The students would still stare when he walked into a room, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to show them who he really was. Not the quiet new kid from Pine Heights, not just another face they expected to fail. He would show them the Terrell his grandfather knew, the one who could make a piano sing. With that thought, he drifted off to sleep, his fingers still moving slightly, playing invisible keys against his blanket. 2 weeks had passed since Terrell's first day at Westfield Middle School, and nothing had improved with Mrs. Fletcher. If anything, her treatment of him had grown worse with each music class. On Monday morning, Terrell sat at the kitchen table eating cereal while his mother ironed his uniform. The radio played softly in the background, a morning news show discussing local politics. "I noticed you haven't been practicing as much lately," his mother said, smoothing out a wrinkle in his shirt. "Everything okay with music class?" Terrell stirred his cereal, watching the flakes swirl in the milk. "It's fine." His mother set down the iron and looked at him. Her eyes, always sharp, missed nothing. "Terrell Jackson, I've known you your entire life. Fine doesn't make you stop playing piano." He sighed, shoulders slumping. "Mrs. Fletcher doesn't like me." "The music teacher? Why do you say that?" "She never calls on me even when I'm the only one with my hand up." Yesterday she told me my uniform wasn't tucked in properly in front of everyone, but Tommy's shirt was completely untucked, and she didn't say anything to him. Terrell poked at his cereal. And she put me in the back row of the choir even though I can sing better than most of the kids in front. His mother sat across from him, her nurse's ID badge already clipped to her pocket. Baby, sometimes people have expectations about who we are before they even know us. You mean because I'm black? She nodded slowly. Some people carry old wrong ideas in their hearts. It's not fair and it's not right, but it's something we still have to deal with. What should I do? Keep your head up. Do your best work. And remember that your worth isn't determined by how Mrs. Fletcher or anyone else sees you. She reached across the table and took his hand. You are brilliant and talented, Terrell. Don't let anyone make you forget that. The school bus ride was rowdy as usual. Terrell sat alone watching raindrops race down the window. He thought about what his mother had said. He'd faced kids who didn't like him before, but never a teacher who seemed determined to make him feel small. First period was English. Ms. Powell handed back their essays on To Kill a Mockingbird. Terrell had worked hard on his, staying up late to get it just right. Excellent work, Terrell, she said, placing his paper on his desk. A bright red A sat at the top along with a note. Thoughtful analysis. You have a strong voice. That small victory carried him through the morning. By lunchtime, he'd even made a tentative friend, Damon, a boy with thick glasses who sat next to him in math class. They sat together in the cafeteria talking about video games and comparing notes on teachers. You have Fletcher for music, right? Damon asked, unwrapping his sandwich. She's tough. Yeah, Terrell replied, not wanting to say more. Damon leaned closer. My brother had her last year. Said she's old school and plays favorites. Don't take it personally if she's hard on you. But it was hard not to take it personally when he walked into music class that afternoon and Mrs. Fletcher's smile disappeared the moment she saw him. Today, we'll be practicing for the winter concert, she announced. I need to assess everyone's vocal range for choir placement. One by one, she called students to the piano, played a scale, and had them sing. Most did okay. Not great, but okay. When it was Terrell's turn, he stood straight and focused on the music. Mrs. Fletcher played the scale, and Terrell sang it perfectly, hitting each note with precision. His voice was clear and strong, the result of years singing in his grandfather's church choir. Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. She played a more difficult pattern, and again Terrell followed flawlessly. Was all she said. You may sit down. When she posted the choir assignments later, Terrell found his name in the back row, far from the microphones. That's not fair, Damon whispered. You're one of the best singers. Terrell just shrugged. But inside a knot tightened in his chest. After school, instead of taking the bus, Terrell walked the long route home, kicking stones along the sidewalk. The gray clouds matched his mood. By the time he reached their apartment building, rain was falling steadily. He found a note on the kitchen counter. His mother would be working a double shift. There was money for pizza delivery if he wanted. Instead of ordering food, Terrell sat at the piano. His fingers hovered over the keys for a long moment before he began to play. The music started soft and sad, a minor key expressing everything he couldn't say aloud. Gradually, it transformed, becoming stronger, more determined. He played for nearly an hour, losing himself in the notes. When he finally stopped, he felt better. Not great, but better. The phone rang. It was Grandpa Joe. Your mama called. Said you're having trouble with that teacher. She doesn't like me, Grandpa. Nothing I do is good enough. His grandfather was quiet for a moment. You know, when I was first playing in clubs, there were places that wouldn't let me in the front door. Had to come through the kitchen, play my set, then leave right after. What did you do? I played so good they couldn't ignore me. Made them listen. Music has power, Terrell. Sometimes it's the only voice we get. After they hung up, Terrell checked the calendar. His grandfather had arranged for him to play in a community recital next month at the cultural center in their old neighborhood. He'd been practicing a piece by Chopin that flowed into an improvised jazz section, a blend of classical and jazz that Grandpa Joe had helped him arrange. Mrs. Fletcher would hate it. The thought made him smile. The next day in music class, Mrs. Fletcher announced they would be studying music notation. Can anyone tell me what this symbol means? She asked, pointing to the board. Terrell knew the answer, a fermata, indicating a note should be held longer than its normal value. He raised his hand along with a few other students. Mrs. Fletcher called on every other student first. When they gave wrong answers, she gently corrected them. When there was no one left but Terrell, she finally nodded in his direction. Fermata, he said. It means to hold the note longer than written. At the performer's discretion. Correct, she said flatly, as if the word tasted bitter. Later, as they practiced a simple piece on the classroom's small electric keyboards, Mrs. Fletcher walked around offering guidance. She stopped behind each student, listening and suggesting improvements. When she reached Terrell, she stood silently for a moment. He played the piece perfectly, adding a slight dynamic variation that made the simple melody more interesting. You're not following the sheet music exactly, she said. Please stick to what's written. But I played all the right notes, Terrell said. I just made it more expressive. This is a classical music class, not a jazz club, Mrs. Fletcher replied, loud enough for nearby students to hear. We respect the composer's intentions. Heat rose in Terrell's cheeks. Several students glanced over, some with pity, others with hidden smirks. That evening, Terrell told his mother what had happened. Maybe I should talk to her, his mother said, her eyes flashing with the protective anger of a parent. No, Terrell said quickly. Please don't. It would just make things worse. His mother looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she nodded. All right, but if it keeps getting worse, I'm stepping in. No one treats my son that way. That night, Terrell practiced harder than ever, not for Mrs. Fletcher, but for himself, for the upcoming recital, for Grandpa Joe, who had taught him that music was freedom. The next week brought news that excited the whole school. Westfield would be hosting a special assembly where students would showcase their talents. Parents, school board members, and even local news would attend. Our music department will feature prominently, Mrs. Fletcher told the class, beaming. I've selected a few advanced students to perform. She read the list of names. Terrell's wasn't on it. After class, he approached her desk. Mrs. Fletcher? I was wondering if I could play something for the assembly. She looked up, surprised by his boldness. The students have already been chosen, Mr. Jackson. But you haven't heard me play piano, not really. I've made my decision, she said sharply. This is an important event for our school's reputation. We need our best performers. The unspoken message was clear. She didn't consider him among the best. That evening, Terrell practiced until his fingers ached. Each note was a word in a language Mrs. Fletcher refused to hear. He played Beethoven, Mozart, and Chopin, the acceptable composers from her list, but also Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk, the music that made his soul sing. His mother found him still at the piano when she came home from her shift. You'll wake the neighbors, she said, but her smile was proud. I'm going to play at that assembly, Terrell said, his eyes determined. Somehow, his mother sat beside him on the bench. You know, your grandfather didn't get his first real gig by being invited. He showed up, waited for his moment, and took it. She kissed his forehead. Sometimes opportunities aren't given, Terrell. Sometimes we have to make them. As he lay in bed that night, an idea began to form in Terrell's mind. Mrs. Fletcher thought she knew him, thought she knew what he was capable of, but she had never really listened. Maybe it was time to make her hear him. The day of the school assembly arrived with an electric buzz in the air. Westfield Middle School had been transformed overnight. The usual morning announcements were replaced with reminders about the afternoon event. Teachers spoke with extra enthusiasm, and even the cafeteria served special desserts with lunch. For Terrell, though, the day dragged with a heavy weight. He'd spent the past week watching other students practice their assembly performances during music class, while he sat in his corner seat, invisible to Mrs. Fletcher. You nervous about your recital this weekend? Damon asked as they sat together at lunch. In the weeks since they'd first talked, Damon had become a real friend, the only one Terrell had made at Westfield. A little, Terrell admitted. He pushed his tray away, too anxious to eat. My grandpa's bringing some important people. Musicians he knows. Wish I could come see it, Damon said. Bet you're awesome, Terrell smiled weakly. Thanks. Hey, too bad Fletcher didn't pick you for today. Would have shown everyone what they're missing. The afternoon classes were shortened to make time for the assembly. As students filed into the large auditorium, excitement hummed through the crowd. Parents chatted in the back rows. Teachers directed traffic, and a local newspaper photographer set up near the stage. Terrell slid into a seat in the middle section, trying to blend in. The stage had been transformed with special lighting, and the school's grand piano, usually locked away in the music storage room, gleamed under the spotlight. Principal Rivera stepped up to the microphone. "Welcome, everyone, to Westfield's celebration of arts and excellence. We're proud to showcase our talented students today." The program began with a speech from the student body president, followed by the science club demonstrating a small robot they'd built. Next came a poetry reading, then a performance from the school's dance team. Mrs. Fletcher sat in the front row, her back straight as a ruler. Every few minutes she would turn to scan the audience, making sure everyone was paying proper attention to Westfield's finest. After the dance team finished, Mrs. Fletcher rose and walked to the microphone. Her gray suit matched her tightly pulled back hair, giving her the appearance of a statue come to life. "Good afternoon. I'm Mrs. Fletcher, director of Westfield's award-winning music program. Today we have several outstanding musical performances that demonstrate the excellence we cultivate here." She gestured to the right side of the stage. "First, our string quartet will perform Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik." 4 students walked out carrying their instruments. They played well, not perfectly, but well enough. The audience applauded politely when they finished. Mrs. Fletcher beamed with pride. Next, we have a piano solo by Anthony Chen, one of our most dedicated students. Anthony will play Beethoven's Für Elise. Anthony, a thin boy with carefully combed hair, walked to the piano and sat down. His performance was technically correct but stiff, as if he were more focused on not making mistakes than on feeling the music. Mrs. Fletcher applauded loudly when he finished. "Beautiful, Anthony. Just beautiful." 2 more musical acts followed, a flute solo and a vocal duet. Each received Mrs. Fletcher's effusive praise, though to Terrell's ears none had played with real feeling. As the applause for the vocal duet faded, Mrs. Fletcher returned to the microphone. "Our next planned performer, Lily, unfortunately came down with laryngitis yesterday." She paused, looking genuinely distressed. "We have a gap in our program." Terrell sat up straighter. Something about the way Mrs. Fletcher's eyes scanned the audience made his heart beat faster. "Rather than shorten our celebration, I thought we might have a spontaneous demonstration." Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Music education isn't just about our advanced students. It's about creating opportunities for everyone." The spotlight swept across the audience, stopping at random students who giggled and shook their heads. It was like a game. Who would get picked for this unexpected moment? The light settled on Terrell. "Mr. Jackson," Mrs. Fletcher called, her voice syrupy sweet. "Why don't you come up and help us out? Show us what you've learned in music class." A hush fell over the auditorium. Terrell felt every eye turn toward him. His first instinct was to shake his head, to shrink into his seat. But then he remembered his grandfather's words. Music has power. Sometimes it's the only voice we get. Slowly, he stood. "Wonderful," Mrs. Fletcher said, her smile tightening. "Come right up to the piano." The walk to the stage felt endless. Each step echoed in the silent auditorium. As he passed the front row, Terrell saw Damon give him a thumbs up. Though his friend's face looked worried, on stage, the spotlight was blinding. Mrs. Fletcher stood by the piano, her hand resting possessively on its polished surface. "Now, Terrell," she said, loud enough for the first few rows to hear, "I know you haven't had the advantages of most of our students, but music is universal, isn't it? Anyone can try." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't an opportunity, it was a setup. She expected him to fail, to fumble at the keys, to prove her assumptions right in front of the entire school and their parents. "What would you like me to play, Mrs. Fletcher?" Terrell asked, keeping his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside. She reached into her folder and pulled out sheet music. "Since we lost Lily's vocal performance of Schubert's Ave Maria, perhaps you could attempt the accompaniment." She placed the complex classical piece on the piano stand. "Just do your best. No one expects perfection." But her tone said the opposite, that she expected nothing but failure from him. Terrell sat on the bench, adjusting its height. The keys felt different from his piano at home, more responsive with a lighter touch. He took a deep breath and looked at the sheet music. He recognized the piece. His grandfather had played it many times, though with his own jazzy interpretation that would have horrified Mrs. Fletcher. "Whenever you're ready," she said. stepping back with a small smile, like a cat who had cornered a mouse. Terrell placed his hands on the keys. The auditorium was so quiet he could hear the air conditioning humming. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his mother working double shifts so he could have opportunities, of his grandfather teaching him that music was a language that spoke from the soul. Then he began to play. The first notes of Ave Maria flowed from his fingers. Soft, delicate, reverent. He followed the sheet music exactly, his hands moving with practiced precision. Each note rang clear and true in the silent auditorium. From the corner of his eye, he saw Mrs. Fletcher's smile falter. She had expected hesitation, mistakes, embarrassment. Instead, Terrell played with the confidence of someone who had spent years practicing. As he reached the middle section, Terrell allowed himself to add subtle changes, tiny variations in tempo and dynamics that breathed life into the piece. Not enough to claim he wasn't following the music, but enough to transform it from a technical exercise into something beautiful. The audience sat motionless. Even the restless younger siblings had stopped fidgeting. Principal Rivera leaned forward in her seat, her eyebrows raised in surprise. Mrs. Fletcher's face had gone from smug certainty to confusion to something like alarm. She stepped forward as if to stop him, then seemed to realize how that would look to the audience and parents. Instead, she stood frozen, watching as her plan backfired. Terrell felt a surge of confidence with each measure. This moment, this was what his grandfather had prepared him for. Not just to play notes, but to speak through them. As he neared the end of the piece, he looked directly at Mrs. Fletcher. Their eyes met, and in that moment, he saw something shift in her expression. The surprise was there, yes, but also something deeper. The uncomfortable recognition that she had been wrong. Completely wrong. Terrell played the final chords, letting them resonate fully before lifting his hands from the keys. For a moment, the auditorium remained silent. Then it erupted. The applause started in the back and rolled forward like a wave, growing louder until it filled the space. Students stood from their seats clapping and cheering. Principal Rivera was on her feet, a wide smile on her face. Even some parents were standing, though they didn't even know who he was. In the midst of it all, Mrs. Fletcher stood rigid, her hands at her sides. Her plan to humiliate him had instead become his moment of triumph. Principal Rivera stepped up to the microphone. "Well, it seems we have discovered a hidden talent at Westfield. Thank you, Terrell, for that beautiful performance." Terrell nodded politely and stood to leave the stage. As he passed Mrs. Fletcher, he heard her whisper, "Where did you learn to play like that?" He paused and looked at her directly. "My grandfather taught me. He played jazz in clubs across the country before anyone would let him on a classical stage." He walked off, leaving her speechless. In the audience, Damon was jumping up and down, shouting something Terrell couldn't hear over the continued applause. Several students he'd never spoken to were smiling at him. A girl in the front row gave him a thumbs up. As Terrell returned to his seat, something had changed. He was no longer invisible, and more importantly, he had used music to speak when words would not have been enough. The assembly continued, but Terrell barely noticed the remaining performances. His mind was racing ahead. This moment, this unexpected opportunity had shown him something important. His talent couldn't be denied, even by those determined not to see it. When the final bell rang at the end of the day, Terrell couldn't wait to get home and tell his mother and grandfather what had happened. For once, he had a story from Westfield that wouldn't make them worry. But as he headed toward the bus, he heard Mrs. Fletcher's voice behind him. "Mr. Jackson, a word, please." Terrell turned slowly at the sound of Mrs. Fletcher's voice. Students streamed past him toward the buses, some giving him curious glances, others offering small smiles or nods of approval. His moment on stage had changed something, but Mrs. Fletcher's tone still made his stomach tighten. "Yes, ma'am," he said, gripping his backpack straps. Mrs. Fletcher stood with perfect posture, her face unreadable. "Come back to the music room." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away. Terrell hesitated, glancing toward the buses. If he missed his ride, it would be a long walk home. But curiosity won out. He followed her through the emptying hallways. The music room felt different in the after-school quiet. Sunlight slanted through the windows, catching dust particles floating in the air. The grand piano had been returned from the auditorium and sat majestically in the corner. Mrs. Fletcher closed the door behind them and walked to her desk. For a long moment she shuffled papers without speaking. Terrell stood awkwardly by the door, wondering if he should sit. Finally, she looked up. That was quite a performance. Terrell couldn't tell if she was angry or impressed. Maybe both. "Thank you, ma'am. How long have you been playing piano?" "Since I was 4. My grandfather taught me." "Your grandfather?" She said the word carefully as if testing it. "He was a professional musician?" "Yes, ma'am. Jazz mostly, but he knows classical too. He played with some big bands back in the day." Mrs. Fletcher's lips thinned slightly at the mention of jazz, but she continued. "Why didn't you say anything about your experience when you arrived?" The question caught Terrell off guard. I tried to participate in class. You never asked if I played." Something flickered across her face. Perhaps recognition of the truth in his words. She had never bothered to ask what he could do, what he knew. "Well," she said, straightening a pen on her desk, "you clearly have technical proficiency. Your performance today was adequate." Terrell bit back a smile. He knew it had been better than adequate. The audience's reaction had made that clear, but he just nodded. "The winter concert is in 6 weeks," Mrs. Fletcher continued. "We need a piano accompanist for several pieces." She paused, seeming to struggle with her next words. "Would you be interested in the position?" Terrell blinked in surprise. Just days ago, this same teacher had deliberately set him up to fail in front of the entire school. Now she was offering him a featured role? "I would," he said cautiously. "But I have some questions." Mrs. Fletcher raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to students negotiating with her. "Yes? Will I get to practice on the grand piano? And will I be acknowledged in the program like the other soloists?" His boldness surprised even himself. 3 weeks ago, he would have simply said yes, grateful for any recognition. But something had shifted when he sat at that piano on stage. He'd found his voice. Mrs. Fletcher studied him for a long moment. "Yes to both questions. You'll need to stay after school twice a week for rehearsals with the choir. I'll need a parent's permission. My mom works double shifts at the hospital sometimes, but she'll sign whatever's needed." Mrs. Fletcher nodded stiffly. "Very well. We'll start Monday." She turned back to her papers, a clear dismissal. As Terrell reached for the door handle, she spoke again. "Mr. Jackson," he turned. "Don't be late." He nodded and left, breaking into a run as soon as he was in the hallway. He might still catch the late bus if he hurried. He made it just as the doors were closing. The bus driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, recognized him. "There he is. Our piano man." She opened the doors with a smile. "That was something in the assembly today, honey." "Just something else." Terrell ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased as he made his way down the aisle. The bus was half empty, most students already gone. But those remaining looked up as he passed. "Dude, that was sick today," called a boy he recognized from his English class. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" "My grandpa taught me," Terrell answered, sliding into an empty seat. "You should join band," another kid suggested. "We need a decent keyboard player." By the time the bus dropped him at his stop, Terrell felt like he was floating. He practically ran up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, fumbling with his key in his excitement. His mother wasn't home yet, still at her shift at the hospital. He dropped his backpack and went straight to the phone, dialing his grandfather's number. "Grandpa Joe, you're not gonna believe what happened today." He poured out the whole story. Mrs. Fletcher calling him to the stage. Her attempt to embarrass him, his performance, the audience's reaction, and finally the offer to play for the winter concert. His grandfather chuckled on the other end. "Didn't I tell you? Music speaks when words can't. You showed her who you are." "She still doesn't really like me," Terrell admitted, "but I think she respects me now. At least a little. That's how change starts, son. Not all at once, but little by little. Now tell me about this weekend. You still practicing for the recital?" "Every day. But now I'm not as nervous. After today, it feels like I can play for anybody." After hanging up, Terrell sat at his piano. His fingers moved over the familiar keys, playing the same Schubert piece from the assembly, but this time with his grandfather's jazzy flourishes. The music filled the small apartment, spilling out through the open window into the early evening air. The next morning at school felt different. As Terrell walked through the hallways, he noticed small changes. Students who had never spoken to him nodded or waved. A girl from his math class asked if he'd help with the music for her dance team routine. His usual corner of the cafeteria was suddenly less empty. with Damon bringing over 2 other boys from the science club who wanted to talk about forming a band. "You're like a celebrity now," Damon joked, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Don't forget us little people when you're famous," Terrell laughed, as if. "It was just one song." "Yeah, but you showed everybody up, especially Fletcher. That's legendary status around here." Even some teachers treated him differently. Ms. Powell stopped him after English class. "That was quite impressive yesterday, Terrell. Do you have plans to study music in the future?" "Maybe," he replied, surprising himself with the confidence in his voice. "I love playing." Only Mrs. Fletcher remained cool, though not openly hostile anymore. In music class that Friday, she acknowledged his raised hand twice and even nodded approvingly when he gave the right answer about chord progressions. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't the dismissive treatment he'd grown used to. After class, she handed him a folder. "These are the pieces for the winter concert. I expect you to be familiar with them by Monday's rehearsal." Terrell flipped through the sheet music, 5 complex pieces, all classical. "Yes, ma'am. I'll learn them." She seemed about to say something else, then just nodded and turned away. That weekend was Terrell's recital at the community center in his old neighborhood. His mother took the evening off, dressing in her nicest outfit. Grandpa Joe arrived early, helping to set up chairs and chatting with the other musicians he'd invited. The community center wasn't fancy like Westfield's auditorium. The piano was an old upright with a few chipped keys, and the folding chairs creaked when people shifted in their seats. But the room was packed with faces Terrell knew. Neighbors, friends from his old school, his grandfather's musician buddies. When it was his turn to perform, Terrell walked to the piano with his head high. He'd chosen a challenging piece, Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, that flowed into an improvised jazz section his grandfather had helped him arrange. As his fingers touched the keys, Terrell thought about how much had changed in just one day. The boy who had sat invisible in Mrs. Fletcher's class was gone. In his place was someone who knew his worth, someone who could speak through music in ways words could never capture. He played with everything he had, not to prove anything to anyone, but because music was his truth. The classical section was precise and emotional, and when he transitioned into the jazz improvisation, he let his heart lead his hands, creating something new in the moment. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. His mother wiped tears from her eyes. Grandpa Joe stood leading a standing ovation. But what made Terrell's heart skip was the figure standing at the back of the room. Principal Rivera from Westfield, watching with a thoughtful expression. After the recital, she approached him. "That was extraordinary, Terrell. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you'd be playing in our winter concert, but she didn't tell me how talented you truly are. Thank you." "Ma'am," Terrell replied, surprised to see her there. "I wonder," she said, "if you might consider playing this piece at our concert as well. We try to showcase diverse musical traditions, and your blend of classical and jazz was remarkable." Before Terrell could answer, his grandfather stepped up beside him. "He'd be honored, wouldn't you, Terrell?" Principal Rivera smiled. "Wonderful. Oh, and Mrs. Fletcher asked me to give you this if I saw you." She handed him an envelope before moving away to speak with other parents. Terrell opened it curiously. Inside was a short note in Mrs. Fletcher's precise handwriting. "Impressive technique on the Chopin. See you Monday. Don't be late." Not exactly warm, but coming from Mrs. Fletcher, it was practically a love letter. "What is it?" his mother asked, joining them. Terrell showed her the note. "I think Mrs. Fletcher might be starting to see me differently." His grandfather put an arm around his shoulders. "People can change, Terrell. Sometimes they just need their eyes opened a little, or their ears." As they walked home under the streetlights, Terrell felt something he hadn't experienced since moving to the new neighborhood. Hope. Not just that Mrs. Fletcher would treat him better, but that he had found a way to be seen for who he truly was. Monday would bring new challenges. Mrs. Fletcher wasn't going to transform overnight. But Terrell now knew something important. His music was powerful enough to make even the most closed minds listen. The weeks leading up to Westfield's winter concert transformed Terrell's school experience. 3 afternoons a week, he stayed after school to practice with the choir, his fingers dancing across the keys of the grand piano while 20 students sang under Mrs. Fletcher's direction. Those rehearsals were a strange middle ground, not friendly, but no longer hostile. Mrs. Fletcher spoke to him directly about tempo changes, dynamics, and phrasing. She corrected his playing when needed, but without the cutting edge her criticism once carried. And occasionally, when he played a particularly beautiful passage, Terrell caught her nodding in quiet approval. "Again from measure 36, she would say, tapping her baton on the music stand. And Terrell, more feeling in the bridge this time. He found himself looking forward to those afternoons despite the awkwardness. The music room after hours had a peaceful quality, with golden afternoon light streaming through the windows and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with others. At home, Terrell divided his practice time between the concert pieces and the special Chopin jazz fusion he would perform as a solo. Principal Rivera had insisted on including it in the program, writing Musical Worlds Collide Classical Meets Jazz in the concert listing. Mrs. Fletcher didn't look too happy about that. Terrell told his grandfather during their weekly phone call. Grandpa Joe chuckled. "Bet she didn't, but that's good for her. Stretches her ears a bit. She's been different since the assembly. Not nice exactly, but different. People can surprise you, son. Sometimes they just need their world shaken up a little." His mother noticed the change too. "You're playing more than ever," she said one evening, leaning against the doorframe as he practiced. "And you seem happier. Things are better at school. I've got friends now. And next week is the concert." She sat beside him on the piano bench, smoothing his hair with her hand. "I requested the night off months ago. Wouldn't miss it for anything. Grandpa's coming too, and bringing some of his musician friends," she smiled. "Good. Let them see what my boy can do." At school, Terrell's social circle had expanded beyond just Damon. He ate lunch with a group now, and kids from band class often asked his opinion on music. Teachers who had barely noticed him before now greeted him by name in the hallways. Only a few students still gave him cold looks, mostly Anthony and his friends, who had been Mrs. Fletcher's favorites before Terrell arrived. Anthony had been replaced as the piano accompanist for the concert, a fact he clearly hadn't forgiven. "Don't worry about them," Damon said when he caught Anthony glaring at them in the cafeteria. "They're just jealous because you're better." The night of the concert arrived with a blast of December cold. Snow flurries danced under the streetlights as families hurried into the warm school auditorium. Backstage, students in formal black and white attire whispered nervously, adjusting bow ties and smoothing skirts. Terrell peered through the curtain gap at the filling seats. His mother sat in the third row, beautiful in the blue dress she saved for special occasions. Beside her was Grandpa Joe, looking dapper in his old performance suit, surrounded by several older men who had to be the jazz musicians he'd promised to bring. Principal Rivera stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone. The auditorium lights dimmed, and the concert began with the string orchestra playing a medley of holiday classics. Terrell watched from the wings, his hands moving unconsciously along with the music, playing invisible keys against his pants leg. Mrs. Fletcher appeared beside him, elegant in a floor-length black dress, her usual severe bun softened by a few loose curls. "Ready?" she asked. Terrell nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Your solo is after the choir's second piece. Don't forget the ritardando and the final measures of Silent Night." "I won't." She hesitated, then added, "Your grandfather is here? The jazz musician?" "Yes, ma'am. Third row next to my mom." Mrs. Fletcher glanced toward the audience, though she couldn't see specific faces from their position. "I look forward to hearing your fusion piece. It's certainly different from our usual program." Coming from Mrs. Fletcher, this was practically a ringing endorsement. The string orchestra finished to enthusiastic applause, and soon it was time for Terrell and the choir. He walked to the piano with confidence, adjusting the bench and nodding to Mrs. Fletcher that he was ready. For the next 20 minutes, Terrell accompanied the choir through a series of winter songs, from traditional carols to a complex arrangement of Carol of the Bells that required his complete concentration. The choir sounded beautiful, their voices blending in perfect harmony above his playing. When they finished their set, the audience erupted in applause. Mrs. Fletcher turned to acknowledge Terrell at the piano, gesturing for him to stand and take a bow alongside the choir, a small gesture of respect she hadn't offered during rehearsals. Then came the moment Terrell had been waiting for. The choir exited, leaving him alone on stage with the piano. Principal Rivera stepped up to the microphone. "For our next piece, we have something special. Terrell Jackson will perform Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu with an original jazz interpretation. This unique fusion represents the diverse musical traditions that enrich our cultural landscape. The auditorium fell silent as Terrell positioned his hands over the keys. He took a deep breath, thinking of all the hours of practice. All the afternoons his grandfather had sat beside him on their old piano bench, teaching him that music had no boundaries. He began with Chopin as written, the rapid, flowing notes cascading like water, the melody soaring above the complex left-hand accompaniment. The classical section was demanding, requiring technical precision and emotional depth. Terrell lost himself in the music, forgetting the audience, forgetting everything except the conversation between his hands and the piano. Then came the transition, the moment where classical flowed into jazz. He had practiced this countless times, but tonight, inspired by the audience and the significance of the moment, he improvised something new. The familiar Chopin themes appeared in swing time, with blue notes and syncopated rhythms that transformed the piece while honoring its essence. From the corner of his eye, he could see his grandfather nodding in approval, a wide smile on his face. Several of the jazz musicians were leaning forward in their seats, clearly impressed by the seamless blend of styles. And there, standing in the wings, was Mrs. Fletcher. Instead of the disapproval he might have expected, her expression was one of genuine interest, perhaps even admiration. She was seeing something new, hearing possibilities she hadn't considered. As the piece built to its conclusion, Terrell brought back elements of the classical original, but now infused with the freedom and expression of jazz. The final chords rang through the auditorium, hanging in the air for a moment before fading to silence. The applause began slowly, then built to a thunderous standing ovation. His grandfather's musician friends were on their feet, whistling and clapping. His mother wiped tears from her eyes, her face shining with pride. Even Anthony and his friends were clapping, though perhaps not as enthusiastically as others. Principal Rivera returned to the microphone, beaming. Extraordinary. Thank you, Terrell, for sharing your remarkable talent with us. As Terrell stood to bow, he noticed Mrs. Fletcher had stepped onto the stage. She walked to the microphone, something unplanned based on Principal Rivera's surprised expression. I would like to say something, if I may, Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice carrying across the now quiet auditorium. In my 30 years of teaching music, I have emphasized the importance of tradition and classical training. She paused, looking directly at Terrell. Tonight, one of our students has reminded me that music is not limited by boundaries we create. It grows, changes, and surprises us if we are willing to listen. She turned to Terrell and, in a gesture that left him speechless, extended her hand. Thank you for teaching me something new. The audience applauded again as Terrell shook her hand. It wasn't a complete transformation. He could still sense her traditional reservations. But it was a genuine acknowledgement, a bridge across the divide that had separated them. The rest of the concert passed in a blur. Afterward, the auditorium lobby filled with proud parents and excited students. Terrell found himself surrounded by well-wishers, including several of his grandfather's musician friends who offered business cards and invitations to visit their studios. You've got something special, kid, one elderly saxophonist told him. Don't let anybody tell you different. His mother hugged him tightly. I'm so proud of you. So proud. Grandpa Joe's eyes shone with unshed tears. You played your heart out tonight, son. Couldn't have done better myself. As the crowd thinned, Terrell spotted Mrs. Fletcher speaking with Principal Rivera near the auditorium doors. She saw him looking and excused herself, walking over to where he stood with his family. Mr. Jackson, she said formally, that was a remarkable performance. Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. She nodded to his grandfather. You must be Terrell's teacher. He mentioned you've played professionally. Joe Jackson, Grandpa Joe said, extending his hand. Been playing jazz for 60 years now. I've always focused on classical tradition myself, she admitted. But perhaps... She hesitated, then continued with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Perhaps I could learn more about jazz interpretation. For the benefit of my students, of course. Grandpa Joe smiled. Music's music, ma'am. Just different ways of letting the soul speak. Something shifted in Mrs. Fletcher's expression. Not a complete transformation, but a crack in a wall that had stood for decades. Indeed. Well, Terrell, I'll see you in class on Monday. We'll begin preparations for the spring concert. I think a jazz component might be educational for everyone. As she walked away, Terrell's mother squeezed his shoulder. "Look at that. You didn't just play music tonight, you changed something important." On the drive home, with snow falling gently outside the car windows, Terrell thought about everything that had happened since that first day in Mrs. Fletcher's class. He had arrived at Westfield feeling small and invisible, certain that someone like Mrs. Fletcher would never see his value. Yet tonight, through nothing but his talent and perseverance, he had not only proven his worth but had actually opened a mind that seemed permanently closed. The music he loved, the blending of his grandfather's jazz with classical traditions, had built a bridge where words could not. "You're quiet, baby," his mother said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "Tired from all that playing?" "Just thinking," Terrell replied, "about how different things are now." "That's how change happens," Grandpa Joe said from the front seat. "Not all at once with fanfare and fireworks, but slowly, one person at a time, one note at a time." Terrell smiled, watching the snowflakes dance in the glow of the streetlights. He wasn't naive enough to think that one concert had erased all prejudice, or that Mrs. Fletcher had completely changed overnight. The road ahead would still have challenges, but tonight had shown him something powerful, that his music could speak in ways his words could not. That talent, honestly shared, could open doors and minds that seemed firmly closed. And that was worth all the difficult days that had come before.